If you've been playing Pokemon for a while, you probably think you've seen every single Pokemon sprite. Well, I'm here to tell you that you're wrong. Back in the good old days before Generation 6, Pokemon games used battle sprites for each Pokemon that would get updated in each new generation. And more often than not, games within the same generation would have unique sprites for every Pokemon. Because of this, there are Pokemon sprites that you've probably never seen because they're given a unique design in a game that they don't appear in. First of all, we have to define the criteria for a Pokemon being unseen in a particular game. The first requirement is that a Pokemon can't be caught or obtained in that game either through wild encounters or an in-game gift or an NPC trade. I'm also choosing not to count external transfer methods for this video. That includes mystery gift distributions as well as things like Power Park or the Poke Transfer. Mystery gifts make sense. If you were to play the games today, you wouldn't have access to those events outside of exploits, and even back in the day, they were pretty hard to obtain. Not counting trades or transfers might seem a bit unfair, but I'm taking the point of view of one person playing through each game by themselves with just access to that game. I think that's a fair representation of a lot of players who didn't necessarily grow up with access to every game or have friends or siblings to trade with. And like with mystery gifts, are you really telling me that you have access to a friend that you can trade with today? Especially one with a Gen 1 game and an old Game Boy? I don't think so. The second requirement for a Pokemon to count as unseen is that no NPC trainers can use them in battle against you throughout the game. So essentially, if you can't catch a Pokemon for yourself and you don't battle against it, you'll never see it in a normal solo playthrough of the game. Let's start off the list in Gen 1, and there are two Pokemon that you see in red and blue that you never see in yellow. Those are Electabuzz and Magmar. No trainers use those two in battle in any of the three games, but Electabuzz can be caught in red and Magmar is version exclusive to blue. Given that yellow has its own unique set of sprites to red and blue, that means you'll never see their yellow sprites in-game. Another Pokemon you've probably never seen in the Gen 1 games is Golem, or you can obviously catch Geodude and Graveler in all three games. If we stick to the rule of not including trading, then you'll never see any of Golem's sprites in-game, because unlike other trade evolutions like Gengar or Machamp, no NPC trainers use Golem in any of the three games. The other Gen 1 Pokemon that fits on this list is of course Mew. Obviously, no other trainers use it, and it was only legitimately obtainable via very limited events back in the day. But you could make the argument that it's very well known that you can obtain Mew through glitches in the Gen 1 games, and plenty of people would have seen the sprite attempting to do the glitch themselves. And that's fair enough. Mew does belong on this list, but if you told me that you'd seen Mew sprite in game, I'd give that to you. Before we leave Gen 1, I do have to give an honorable mention to the sprites from the original Japanese Red and Green. These games also had a unique set of sprites, and they're pretty notorious for their rough designs. Now, I'm willing to bet that most of you haven't played the original Japanese versions of the Gen 1 games, so I could easily say that you've never seen them. But you can easily play the original Japanese versions today, and if there's any set of sprites that everyone's seen, it's the original Japanese Gen 1 sprites. So if we just narrow it down to Pokemon that you don't see in Red and Green, just like in the international releases, the only Pokemon that you won't see in-game are Golem and Mew. Getting into Generation 2 now, and Gold, Silver and Crystal each have a unique set of sprites for most Pokemon, so things get a bit specific. There are 7 Pokemon that don't appear at all across all 3 games. They are Omanyte and Kabuto, the 3 legendary birds, Mew and Mewtwo. In Silver, you won't see Gligar, Ursaring or Mantine, as no trainers across Johto or Kanto use these 3 Pokemon, and they're exclusive to Gold and Crystal. In Gold, you'll never see Skarmory or Donphan because again, no trainers use them and they can only be caught in Silver and Crystal. And in Crystal, you'll never see Mareep and technically Ampharos. You can't catch or battle against Mareep in Crystal version, but interestingly, there are a few trainers in the game who use a Flaffy. You obviously see an Ampharos when getting the medicine for the sick Ampharos in the Olivine Lighthouse, but I don't think this registers it in your Pokédex, so you won't see its sprite. It's a bit of a weird one there with the Mareep line kind of being forgotten about in Crystal. You might have noticed that some of the Crystal sprites look very similar to their Gold and Silver sprites. In a lot of cases, the animation in the Crystal sprites is actually the Pokemon swapping between its pose from each game. So you could make the argument that not all of Crystal sprites are unique, but I think the animation plus the subtle design differences mean we can treat each game separately in Gen 2. The last Pokemon that we have to talk about for the Gen 2 games is Celebi. Obviously, no trainer uses Celebi in battle, and it's exclusive to an event that was only distributed for Crystal version. Now, even though I said I wasn't counting event Pokemon, the 3DS version of Pokemon Crystal actually has the Celebi event baked into the game. Much like Deoxys in the Delta episode of Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire, you can catch Celebi in the post-game of Virtual Console Crystal without needing a Wi-Fi or in-person event distribution. I know the 3DS eShop isn't functional anymore, and you can't buy a new version of Pokemon Crystal, but if you already have the Virtual Console version of Crystal, you can play through it and encounter Celebi all on your own, even today. For that reason, the only Celebi sprites I'm counting in this video are the Gold and Silver ones. And really just the gold one. I know I said I was counting crystal sprites as separate, but I mean, come on, look at the crystal sprite and the silver sprite. They're practically the same. Moving on to Generation 3 now, and these games are actually the reason that I wanted to make this video. There are so many unique sprites between the Hoenn games and the Kanto remakes for Pokemon that you can't obtain in one version or another. This is because Game Freak made new sprites for most of the Generation 1 Pokemon for Fire Red and Leaf Green, even if they had not been obtainable in Ruby and Sapphire. Take Hitmonlee for instance. You're probably familiar with this sprite of it from playing through Fire Red or Leaf Green. You battle a few trainers that have Hitmonlee, and you can get yourself one from the Fighting Dojo in Saffron City. But originally, in Ruby and Sapphire, it had this sprite here, which you would never see. It's not catchable in Hoenn in any way, and no trainers use it in Ruby and Sapphire. The only way you would see this sprite in Ruby and Sapphire is if you're doing a link battle with someone who had a Hitmonlee. You have to give Game Freak some credit, I guess, for taking the effort to redesign most of the original 151 sprites for the Kanto remakes, but then in Emerald, they went back to using the Ruby and Sapphire sprites, but then they animated them to make them different again. So I don't really know what they were doing, but they've given me something to talk about. So when we look at the Gen 3 games, a Pokemon still has to satisfy our original criteria of not being able to be caught or battled against in that game, but then it also has to have a unique sprite in that game if it appears in another Generation 3 game. I'll use Mewtwo as an example. You can't catch or battle against it in Ruby, Sapphire, or Emerald, but it has the same sprite in those games as it does in Fire Red and Leaf Green, where you can catch it. So Mewtwo would not make the Gen 3 list. Let's start with the simple ones. Mew, Lugia, Ho-Oh, Celebi, and Jirachi are all unobtainable without events, and obviously not on any trainers' teams. Mew gets a special shout out for having a sprite that's ever so slightly different between the Hoenn and Kanto games. While we're on the topic of legendaries and mythicals, one Pokemon I want to spend some time on is Deoxys. Being a mythical Pokemon, it makes this list pretty much by default, but there's a bit more to Deoxys sprites in the Gen 3 games. I'm sure you know that Deoxys has 4 different forms, each one with different stats and movesets. In most games, you can change Deoxys form by interacting with meteorites placed in each region or with a key item. But in the Generation 3 games, Deoxys form actually changed based on what game it was in and was locked to only one form in each game. In Ruby and Sapphire, it will appear in its normal form. In Emerald, it takes its speed form. In Fire Red, Deoxys will appear in its attack form. And in Leaf Green, its defense form. There is a weird asterisk on this though. If you link battle with someone who has a Deoxys in a different game to yours, its sprite will actually appear in its normal form, but its stats and moveset will still match whatever form it should be in that game. So if you're playing Emerald, battling someone with a Deoxys in Fire Red, it will appear on your screen in its normal form, even though it will actually be an attack form Deoxys with the stats and moves the attack form should have. Now, I'm not counting link battles, the same as I'm not counting trades or transfers, but it's just to make the point that in each Gen 3 game, Deoxys will only appear in its normal form and the form specific to that game. Its other sprites are literally not in the game. With that sidebar out of the way, we can return to the proper list, and we have a bit of a problem. Technically, that's it for the Gen 3 games. Here's all of the sprites that you'll never see in Ruby and Sapphire. They're all Kanto or Johto Pokemon that don't appear in-game, as well as the legendary trios from the last 2 generations. But all of these Pokemon do appear as Pokemon that could be used on Battle Frontier trainers teams in Emerald. I really debated whether or not to include Pokemon who only show up on Battle Frontier trainers teams as being seen in-game. If you don't know how Battle Frontier trainers work, I'll quickly explain. There's a set list of NPC trainers that can appear at all the facilities across the Battle Frontier, and each trainer generates a team at random from a list of available Pokemon. This list is basically every Pokemon in the national dex, except for the box art legendaries and mythicals. Each trainer class typically picks Pokemon from a similar group, and specific trainers are limited by what point in the challenge they appear at. So swimmers typically pick from a list with a lot of water types, and swimmer Gordon, who can only appear in battle 1 to 7, will pick from a weaker list than swimmer Pedro, who can only appear from battle 36 onwards. I've actually made an in-depth video on how Battle Frontier trainers work, so if you're interested to learn more, check that video out. But you see my dilemma. Technically, you could see all of these Pokemon, but because of the partially random nature of NPC trainer selection and how their teams are generated, there's a chance you might not actually ever see some of them. Ultimately, I decided that Battle Frontier exclusive Pokemon do count as being seen in-game for 2 reasons. Number 1, the Battle Frontier is a part of the normal gameplay of Emerald that everyone can play. I haven't counted events and external transfer methods for this video, so it would be a bit unfair of me to discount a feature that's perfectly accessible in the game. And it's a beloved feature too. Chances are, you've seen a lot of these sprites because you spent hours and hours in the Battle Frontier, just like I did. The other reason is that for Ruby, Sapphire, and Emerald, we're only really looking for unique Kanto Pokemon sprites, because between all 5 Gen 3 games, you can actually catch all of the non-legendary Johto Pokemon, and they all use the same sprites across all 5 games. But despite all that, I have come up with a list of 4 Pokemon sprites that you'll never see. Even though I just said all the Johto sprites are the same, there is one exception. For some reason, Teddiursa gets a different sprite in Fire Red and Leaf Green, but you can't catch it in these games, and NPC trainers only use an Ursaring, so you'll never see this sprite normally. The other 3 Pokemon to make this list are Wartortle, Mr. Mime, and Snorlax. Each one of them has a different sprite in Ruby and Sapphire than it does in Emerald. Wartortle was originally a much lighter blue, but they used the Fire Red and Leaf Green recolor on the Ruby and Sapphire sprite for its Emerald sprite. Mr. Mime's left shoulder pad was changed in Emerald to not cover his face. And Snorlax weirdly retains its coloration from Ruby and Sapphire in Emerald, but they changed the claw on its hand to match Fire Red and Leaf Green, as well as giving it a much more neutral expression. I mean, look at him. He looks so content in Ruby and Sapphire, and they made him sad. For what? Now these are really minor differences and they're practically the same sprites, but you'll never see them in Ruby and Sapphire, so they make the list. Coming into Gen 4 now, and like Gen 3, we have a heap of sprite changes across each set of games. Unlike Gen 3 though, there doesn't seem to be a straightforward pattern to the changes.
Some Pokemon have the same sprites in all 5 games. Some Pokemon have different sprites in the Sinnoh games than they do in the Johto games. But then some have the same sprites in Diamond and Pearl, but different sprites in Platinum and the Johto games, and some have different sprites in all 5 games.
It's a mess, but once again, the post-game battle facilities actually make things very simple. Almost every Pokemon across the 5 games that isn't catchable or used by a trainer in any particular game can be randomly selected to be used by a trainer in a battle facility. Whether that's the Battle Tower in Diamond and Pearl or any of the battle facilities at the Battle Frontier in Platinum, Heart Gold, and Soul Silver. So the final list for Gen 4 is actually pretty boring. Across all 5 games, you won't see these mythicals as usual since they're event-only Pokemon. As a fun fact, you could actually transfer over a Shaman, Darkrai, and Deoxys from the Pokemon Ranger games by completing special missions that you received over Wi-Fi. But again, I'm not counting external transfer methods, and you wouldn't be able to get these Pokemon today because you can't access those Wi-Fi events. You might have noticed that there was one mythical missing from that list. While Manaphy would normally count as unobtainable and unbattleable, there is one game where you can actually see its sprite in-game. If you go to Mr. Backlot's mansion in Platinum and read the book on his desk, you'll actually get to see Manaphy and have it registered in your Pokédex. This is because you actually need to see Manaphy in order to fill out the Sinnoh regional decks in Platinum so that you can unlock the national decks. And Game Freak put this book here as a way for you to do so. Because Manaphy has the same sprite in Platinum, Heart Gold, and Soul Silver, the only Manaphy sprite you won't see is the Diamond and Pearl one. This is a good segue to go over Pokemon you don't see in Diamond, Pearl, and Platinum.
You won't see these sprites for Mewtwo, Lugia, and Ho-Oh. All 3 are catchable in Heart Gold and Soul Silver, but they use different sprites in those games.
For the sake of honorable mentions, here's the list of Pokemon you can't catch and can only battle against if they happen to be generated on an enemy team in a battle facility. 2 notable Pokemon that stand out on this list are Tangled and Tropius. Both can be caught in Platinum, but they have different sprites there than they do in Diamond and Pearl, so you'll only see them if you're lucky enough to come up against them in the Battle Tower. This is particularly egregious for Tangela, who got a new evolution in Gen 4 with Tangrowth, and to have it not feature anywhere until post-game battle facility is such a weird decision. And then they went and created a custom sprite for it in Platinum anyway. Rounding out our list is Gen 5, the last games to feature battle sprites. Luckily, Gen 5 is pretty simple. Black and White and Black 2 and White 2 use the same sprites across both sets of games. So all we have to find are any Pokemon who can't be caught or battled in all Gen 5 games. There are a couple of Pokemon who received slight changes to their sprites between Black and White and the sequels. The Unova starters and Cottony had some animation changes, and Arcanine had a color change between games, but as those Pokemon appear in both sets of Gen 5 games, we don't have to worry about them for this list. Let's get the easy ones out of the way first. You'll never see the previous box art legendaries, as well as Mewtwo, and of course, all the previous mythical Pokemon. Again, I'm counting the Gen 5 mythicals Victini, Keldeo, Meloetta, and Genesect as unseeable based on the no events rule. I will say that Gen 5 was around the time that events started to become more publicized and easier to obtain, so it is more likely that you were able to obtain some of these Pokemon, but for the sake of consistency, and because you can't obtain them now, I'm not counting them. Now for the interesting ones. You'll never see the sprites for the first and middle stages of all the previous generations starter Pokemon. The final starter evolutions do appear on certain trainers' teams in battle facilities across Unova, but since there's no way to catch or obtain the old starters in-game, you won't see these other sprites. You also won't see Pichu in any of the Gen 5 games. Surprisingly, Pikachu can't be caught in either set of games, and only Pikachu and Raichu are used by enemy trainers, meaning you'll never see this sprite of Pichu. like Pichu, Shedinja features as the only member of its evolutionary line that you'll never see in game. Nincada and Ninjask are used by trainers in the Gen 5 games, but I guess it's not really a surprise that Shedinja isn't, given Wonder Guard is a weird gimmick to balance around. Now, Nincada could have been caught and sent over from the Dream World, but like other external methods for obtaining Pokemon, I'm not counting the Dream World for this video to keep the focus on a standard playthrough experience. Plus, the Dream World's been shut down since 2014, so if you were to play through these games today, you wouldn't have access to any of the Dream World Pokemon. Another Dream World Pokemon that doesn't appear in the actual games is Duskull. Again, both of its evolutions are used by trainers in Black 2 and White 2, but Duskull itself gets no such love, leaving its sprite unseen. The final Pokemon on this list is one I'm surprised hasn't featured already, Unknown. Even though all the Unknown letters got animated sprites, you'll never see them normally in the Gen 5 games. They can't be caught anywhere in Unova, and not a single trainer uses them in battle. And that's it. That's all the Pokemon sprites you've probably never seen. From Gen 6 onwards, there's obviously still Pokemon who don't appear in certain games because they aren't catchable and aren't used by trainers, but once Game Freak made the transition to 3D models, the models have stayed pretty much the same, with mainly the textures getting updated along the way. So if you've seen Charizard in X and Y, you've really seen Charizard in every other 3DS and Switch game as well. That's it from me. If you found this video interesting or have any Pokemon sprite trivia of your own, feel free to leave a comment below. Thanks for watching.